Guys, what's going on? Welcome back to my channel, and in today's video I am showing you the Indianized version of the TRES Leches cake, and I'm going to be making this eggless. This soft and spongy eggless vanilla cake is soaked in this instant quick homemade rabdi, almost like a creamy concoction of milk, cream and condensed milk with Indianized flavors, which is what TRES Leches is. So it's 3 kinds of milk. So this is my version and I'm showing you how I made this from scratch. Here you go. The first thing you want to do is preheat your oven to 160 degrees Celsius or 325 degrees Fahrenheit. Now in this bowl here I have some yogurt and milk. The yogurt is a very normal store-bought one. You could also use homemade. It's not hung or anything. It's just normal yogurt. To that I've added some milk and given it a good whisk. Now I am adding some baking soda and baking powder to this, and the second I do that, a fizzy reaction starts to happen, and over time it starts to get more and more active and bubbly. So after adding this, I'm just going to give it a quick whisk, and you'll already notice that it's starting to foam up slightly, which is perfect. Now we're just going to keep this aside while we work on the remaining ingredients. So I'm just going to leave this on the side, and now here I have my dry ingredients. So here I have, in a sieve, I am adding some all-purpose flour and castor sugar. I'm going to pass this through a sieve. This ensures that if there are any lumpy bits in the flour or the sugar, they get sifted out and everything is nice, smooth and homogeneous, which is perfect. Now I have sifted my dry ingredients. I'm just going to give it a quick mix with my spatula just to make sure that the sugar and flour are well combined. Now I am going to add some softened room temperature butter to this. Again, as I specified in my vanilla cupcake recipe that I just showed you last week, is that how easy this is to make. You don't need electric beaters. I'm using this tiny whisk here. You just want to mix it until the butter cuts through the rest of the dry ingredients. So all the dry ingredients should be coated in the butter, and eventually this starts to look a lot like sand or breadcrumbs. You can even use your fingers, tip of your fingers if you do not have a whisk, but I highly recommend that you have a whisk at home. I mean, it's a very essential kitchen gadget, or a kitchen tool rather. Now we're going to flavor this with some crushed cardamom pods. You could use some cardamom powder as well. I just like to use freshly crushed cardamom pods as they impart so much more flavor. I'm going to also whisk this and make sure that the cardamom pods, crushed cardamom pods, move throughout the dry ingredients so they're evenly distributed. Now I am going to show you that reaction that we were working on earlier. So look how foamy that has gone. It is so bubbly and it's just going to add so much lightness and fluffiness to the cake. So that's perfect because we want it to be light and fluffy so it can absorb all of that rabri that we'll be making later on. I'm going to put that into the dry ingredients, and now because it is Indianized, I think the most classic Indian mithai flavors are some rose water and cardamom powder. So these are the 2 essential flavors that I add. So I've added a tablespoon of rose water. Now if you're adding rose extract, then you would have to use a slightly smaller quantity because that is more concentrated and more stronger. Now I'm going to use my spatula and fold these ingredients together, making sure that I'm not deflating any of that lovely air that we created by mixing the baking powder and baking soda in the yogurt and milk mix. Now once you have mixed this together, make sure that there are no dry ingredients visible. Keep folding this until all the dry ingredients disappear. You can still see a few lumpy bits here, so the best way to get rid of that is by using a whisk and count to 30 seconds in your head and keep whisking this. You can even set a timer on your phone or just keep an eye on the consistency. It should start to look glossy, smooth, silky, velvety, all of that good stuff that a cake batter should look like. That's what we're looking for. And the minute you get that, it takes roughly 30 seconds. Here I have an 8x8 inch cake tin which is square shaped, and I have greased this with butter. And now I'm going to pour my cake batter into this and spread it evenly as I can with the spatula. Make sure that you don't add the parchment paper at the bottom because you want the cake to absorb all of that rabdi mix that we make later on. And this will go in the oven for 30 to 35 minutes at 160 degrees Celsius or 325 F, and a skewer or a knife inserted in the center must emerge clean. Now while that is baking, it's very important that you time this correctly, alright? So this takes about 30 to 35 minutes. So in the final 10 minutes of the baking of the cake, we're going to start making this rabdi because it has to be super hot. So here I have some milk and some cream. So I've added the milk and cream and I'm going to start mixing this on a medium-high heat. Make sure that the heat at this point is on medium-high because you want this to kind of boil and thicken up eventually. But right now it's on high. And I'm just going to keep mixing this, and you can see that it's starting to bubble and boil away. That's exactly what you want. And the trick here is to keep it nice and hot and to time it right. The second that you add the milk, you need to set a timer on your phone for 6 minutes, and then you need to start heating everything on a high heat. So the milk and the cream is now been heating for 6 minutes, and look at the change in the consistency. I'm going to reduce the heat all the way down to low. And then I'm going to add the condensed milk, which is sweetened condensed milk, and some crushed cardamom pods. I'm going to give this a good mix. Very, very important. The second you add the condensed milk, the heat needs to go all the way down to the lowest setting possible. You do not want to overcook this or overheat this at a very high temperature. I'm also going to add the cardamom pods that I got the seeds from to crush the cardamom seeds, so that adds more flavor. You can always fish it out later once you are ready to serve the cake, but for now we're just going to add that so it imparts more of that cardamom flavor. Heat it on low for about 2 minutes and then immediately pour it into a glass. By now the cake should be ready and you need to immediately start working on this cake. So now you understand the importance of having everything at a high temperature. You're immediately going to start poking holes into the surface of the cake. Go all the way down. Don't worry about the cake breaking apart. It is not going to break apart because it's very snug inside the cake tip. Get as many holes as you can. Like just stab the cake. Go for it. And also make sure you go on the sides because the sides tend to get a bit crusty. So make sure that you're stabbing the cake really well, making as much space as you can for the rabdi to get absorbed into the cake. And now it's time for us to pour the rabdi. You can see how hot it is because as I'm pouring it, the steam is coming off of it. That's the reason it needs to be hot, because it needs to be at this liquid state for the cake to absorb all of that liquid, because as it cools down it will thicken. Now this needs to first cool down to room temperature and then you are going to pop this into the refrigerator overnight. That is for an entire day, probably even 24 hours. The minimum you can do is 8 hours, but I really like to keep it for a full 24 hours. Now one thing about this cake, now just look at that surface. You can start to see the surface of the cake. This is 24 hours later. So the rabdi has completely been absorbed into the cake, and this is the leftover rabdi that I saved in another glass. And look how thick it has gone. That's the reason why it needs to be really hot when you put it into the cake, so it can really absorb into the cake. Now our cake is ready and we are going to start slathering generous amounts of that rabdi onto the cake, and you'll notice that the cake itself is not soggy. It won't be soggy at all. In fact, you won't even taste any liquid consistency like thing when you're biting into that cake, because as you can see now, the rabdi has absorbed into the cake. But what happens is you get that intensely moist flavors and intensely moist texture as well. Now I am going to top this with some flaked nuts. So I'm using flaked almonds and flaked pistachios, and just to add a pop of color, I'm also going to sprinkle it with some rose petals, and that's it. That's basically my Indianized version of the TRES Leches cake. I have added my own touch to this by cooking the milk, but generally the milk is not cooked. If you wish, if you want it to be a little soggy, you can choose not to cook the milks, that is the milk, the cream and the condensed milk. You can just whisk it in a container and then just pour it over the hot cake if that's what you prefer. I really like the fact that this cake is not super soggy. In fact, it's not soggy at all, but it is still very moist, as you can see right now. It's extremely flavorful, and that's the way I like it. But it's highly customizable, and I've included all the details down in the description box below and on my website for you to have a look. Look how delicious that is. This, guys, is so addictive. This cake was over in a day. I'm not even kidding. It was so indulgent and so delicious. That's how good this cake is. I really hope you give this a go. If you enjoyed this video, then don't forget to give it a big thumbs up and also subscribe to my channel and hit the bell icon so you're notified every time I post a new video. I'll see you again next time. Until then, goodbye and happy baking.